Elvis Presley won 3 Grammy Awards. In a career spanning 23 years, in which he recorded over 700 songs, in which he performed to an estimated 1 billion people across television, film, and live concerts. 3 Grammy Awards. And here's the part that is even harder to understand. Not one of them was for rock and roll. Not one was for the music that rewired American culture. Not one was for the voice that broke every rule the music industry had ever written. Not one was for the performances that left audiences breathless and critics scrambling for new words. All 3 were for gospel recordings. How does the man who invented rock and roll win 0 Grammys for rock and roll? How does the artist that every subsequent musician in the second half of the 20th century cited as a primary influence walk away from the Grammy stage with a trophy for a gospel album? This is the story of the most baffling blind spot in music industry history, and what it tells us about the price of being first. To understand the Grammy problem, you have to understand the year 1958. The Grammy Awards were created by the National Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences, known as NARAS, in direct response to the rise of rock and roll. That sentence is worth reading twice. The Grammy Awards were created in direct response to the rise of rock and roll. The music industry establishment, the producers, executives, and critics who had built their careers on big band, jazz, and traditional pop, looked at what was happening and were horrified. Young people were buying records by artists who could barely read music. Radio stations were playing music that the establishment considered crude, primitive, and dangerous. Something had to be done. And so the Grammy Awards were established as a counterweight, a ceremony that would honor the music that the industry insiders believed was genuinely excellent, as opposed to merely popular. The first Grammy ceremony was held on May 4, 1959. The winners were exactly what you would expect. Domenico Modugno, Henry Mancini, the Kingston Trio. The nominees were a careful construction, a list that demonstrated what the Recording Academy considered worthy of recognition. Elvis Presley was not on it. Neither was Chuck Berry. Neither was Little Richard. The 3 artists most responsible for the explosion that had remade American music in the preceding 3 years were entirely absent from the first Grammy ballot. This was not an accident. The founders of the Grammy Awards were quite explicit about what they were trying to do. In interviews from the late 1950s and early 1960s, members of NARAS described their mission as elevating quality music above the noise of rock and roll. They used the word noise specifically. They were building a wall, and on one side of the wall were the artists they respected. On the other side was Elvis. Here is what was happening on Elvis's side of that wall. In 1956 alone, Elvis Presley had 5 #1 singles. He sold more records in a single year than any artist in the history of the music industry up to that point. His appearances on the Ed Sullivan Show were watched by 60 million Americans, nearly a third of the entire U.S. population. He had not just changed popular music. He had changed popular culture. Fashion changed because of Elvis. Language changed because of Elvis. The way young people held their bodies, the way they wore their hair, the way they understood the relationship between music and identity, all of it shifted because of one young man from Tupelo, Mississippi. None of this was considered relevant to the Grammy Awards. The years passed. Elvis was drafted into the Army. He came back. He made movies. He made records. He performed his 1968 comeback special to the largest television audience of the year and received the most unanimous critical praise of his career. No Grammy nomination. In 1969, Elvis entered American Sound Studio in Memphis and recorded a series of sessions that many music historians now consider among the greatest recordings in American popular music. Suspicious Minds, In the Ghetto, Kentucky Rain. These were not lightweight recordings. They were dense, emotionally complex, brilliantly arranged productions that showcased a voice operating at the height of its powers. Suspicious Minds became Elvis's first #1 single in 7 years. Music critics called it a masterpiece. The Grammy Awards called it nothing. In 1971, Elvis received the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. He was 36 years old. The Lifetime Achievement Award is, in the language of award ceremonies, a polite way of honoring someone you have spent years ignoring. It is the institution saying, "We acknowledge that you existed and that your existence was significant." It is not the same as saying, "We recognize your work as excellent." Elvis was 36 years old when the music industry gave him a career retrospective award. He had decades of performing still ahead of him. So what did win? In the years when Elvis was making some of the most commercially successful and critically praised recordings of his career, what was the Grammy Awards recognizing instead? In 1969, the Grammy for Best Male Pop Vocal Performance went to Jose Feliciano. In 1970, it went to Harry Nilsson. In 1971, James Taylor. These were fine artists, but none of them had done what Elvis did. None of them had created a genre. None of them had reshaped a culture. None of them had, to borrow a phrase used repeatedly by musicians who came after, taught everyone else what was possible. There is a specific moment that music historians return to when discussing Elvis and the Grammys. It is the performance of How Great Thou Art at the 1974 Madison Square Garden concert. If you have not heard this recording, stop reading right now and go find it. Come back when you're done. Elvis took an old gospel hymn and transformed it into something that no studio recording had ever captured. His voice moved through registers that most singers cannot access in a single phrase. He built the performance from a whisper to something that seemed to exceed what a human voice should be capable of producing. His backup singers, professionals who had spent their careers in recording studios and concert halls, were visibly undone by what they were witnessing. The audience at Madison Square Garden gave him the standing ovation mid-song. Not at the end, in the middle. Because they could not contain themselves until the end. Elvis won a Grammy for that performance. It was for Best Inspirational Performance. The award category was created specifically for gospel and Christian music. The Recording Academy recognized Elvis Presley's most extraordinary vocal performance by putting it in a category separate from the music they considered mainstream. He died in 1977. The Grammy Awards held a tribute. People said kind things. But the numbers tell a different story. Bob Dylan, 11 Grammy wins. Paul McCartney, 18 Grammy wins. Frank Sinatra, 9 Grammy wins. Elvis Presley, 3 Grammy wins. 0 for rock and roll. In 1986, Elvis was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in its very first class of inductees. The citation described him as simply, "the artist most able to draw together the multiple threads of American musical tradition." The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame understood what the Grammy Awards had spent 2 decades refusing to acknowledge. Today, the question is no longer whether Elvis deserved more recognition from the Recording Academy. That question has been settled by history. The question now, the more interesting question, is what the Grammy Awards treatment of Elvis tells us about institutions and the people who threaten them. Because what Elvis represented in 1958, 1959, 1960 was not just music. He represented change. He represented the arrival of something the establishment had not created and could not control. And institutions, all institutions, not just the Recording Academy, have a consistent and predictable response to things they cannot control. They ignore them. They build walls around them. They give them Lifetime Achievement Awards when they're 36 years old. Elvis Presley recorded If I Can Dream in 1968. He recorded Suspicious Minds in 1969. He performed How Great Thou Art in 1974 in a way that made professional musicians weep. He recorded Unchained Melody in 1977, weeks before his death, in a performance so raw and so complete that it was released without any overdubs because his producer knew that adding anything would diminish it. None of these received Grammy nominations for the categories that mattered. In 2018, 41 years after Elvis died, the Grammy Awards gave him a Special Merit Award. A Special Merit Award. 41 years after his death. There is a comment that appears on Elvis videos regularly. Different people write it, different ages, different countries. But the content is almost always the same. Why does this song never get mentioned as one of the greatest ever recorded? The answer, it turns out, has nothing to do with the song. It has everything to do with who was singing it, and who was in charge of deciding what counted. Elvis Presley won 3 Grammys, all for gospel. Not because gospel was the best thing he did, but because gospel was the one category where the Recording Academy could recognize him without admitting what they had spent 20 years pretending was not true, that he was the greatest, and that they had known it all along.